I'm here with Phillip Blond, the director of Respublica. Having followed and listened to your contribution, I am reminded why you were originally called the Red Tory. In fact, over the past 2 days at Westminster Open Lens, you're the only person that's consistently used the term solidarity, which used to trip off the lips of people on the left. And it's interesting how a lot of the language has changed as people on the left have tried to, live within the liberalism of the Blair Cameron years. From what you said, I was very struck. If we look at Mrs. Merkel's episode with immigration and the great mistake, she was looking at a country which, by all the economic measures and the demography, requires immigration to fuel its machine, look after its elderly, keep its tax base going. So the numbers, in an old-fashioned Fabian way, might have seemed obvious that a society like Germany could incorporate and might have a duty to incorporate those kind of numbers. She opened the doors and immediately got a backlash. And I think your explanation of that is the closest to what I can identify from what happened. What's your view on Merkel and how in Germany they've coped with that syndrome since in the 3 years since she did it?
Well, the trouble is that nations are essentially value-laden entities. And European nations, not for better, for worse, clearly have blood, kith and kin accounts of what it is to be German, what it is to be French. Britain, by contrast, has a civic account. It comes from a more Roman legacy. In Britain, there's never been a racial account of what it is to be British, in part because we've always been an empire since the time of Athelstane. Britain is itself 4 nations, so it's a civic code and it's a continuation of Rome. So to be British, you obey a civic, not a racial code. In contrast, with the destruction of the Pax Christiana in the early 14th century, where each individual European monarch wished to become a pope in his own name, that instituted notions of tribal identity and blood and soil identity in Europe that remains to this day. Now, that level of identification is normal for all human societies. So anthropology tells you that ethnicity is one of the primary forms of identification. So the outliers are the great civic nations, the Romans, the British, the United States in part, because the United States still remains riven by racial fragmentation. And so what Merkel essentially has done, and liberal utopianism has done, is it's assumed a value base that isn't there. And by essentially saying all people are the same, by saying that the values that we have as cosmopolitan liberals are the values of our population, there is nothing that threatens our value set by importing people who don't necessarily uphold our values. And what's interesting about the reaction of those who aren't liberals is actually they're probably right when they say actually nations need to be made up of value consensus, and the importation of, in their language, hostile minorities will destroy what it is to be our nation. And so what Merkel did, in essence, was symbolically essentially induce within Germany a reflex to an earlier form of identity that is more powerful and more widely shared than the liberal identity.
And in the UK, in political structures and parties, and I'm thinking particularly of the Labour Party here and how difficult it has found it to cope with the debate about the impact of immigration. Politicians like John Mann, who could see that a very serious rupture and disjoint was happening in traditional political loyalties, and a number of other people could, but they couldn't explain it, and they certainly didn't have any way of reconnecting with it or articulating it. How do you look at the failures in the British political parties, Labour and Conservative, to cope with these trends, culminating in their leaderships being completely caught out in the Brexit vote?
The point is that both left and right are liberal, so they don't care about the poor. They're indifferent to it. They've abandoned redistribution as a form of security. So the interests of the poor, broadly speaking, are no longer served by social democratic parties of the left. Even worse, the policies followed by, for instance, post-Blairite, and even Lionel Jospin was privatising, in France, essentially induced globalisation that really was antithetical to the economic and social interests of large parts of the working class. It lowered their wage levels, it removed any interest from industry in training them, and it denied them forms of social solidarity where they lived. The classic example in Britain from Michael Young was what happened to council housing in London when it moved from a time served, you were on the waiting list. So if you're a council house owner in the 50s and your children went on the list, longevity gave you a council home, so they would be in the street next to you. So you had social security. In the 60s, need trumped that. So people who had essentially contributed nothing to the country were able to jump, in your eyes, your children for that council home. So what is essentially induced is a sense that free riders were coming who wouldn't share your value systems, and the ruling classes in both left and right were still both brought up into the same value system, and they weren't looking after your interests either. And so it's clear that working class people are not served by either political party, as was, and they seek security, for better or worse, elsewhere.
You mentioned the issue of non-liberal solutions to tackle it. Give me some examples of non-liberal solutions. I think of things like protection of steel industries. We heard in another session here from John Mills about intervention in the markets to lower the exchange rate, specifically because manufacturing communities and organisations, that was the only way that they could survive. Various kinds of ring fencing, entitlements to apprenticeships and things, instead of just a free open market. When you say non-liberal solutions that might give people the confidence that their governments were still, if you like, on their side, what are the kind of actions that might be taken and are taken in other countries?
Let's think of the primary organisers. Let's do the politics of majorities and not the politics of minorities. And the politics of minorities are almost always captured by the upper middle class and to serve upper middle class interests. Modern feminism is a good example. So modern feminism is essentially liberal, upper middle class individuals arguing for more wages for liberal upper class individuals. Modern feminism has completely lost any link to working class women, to the needs of working class women, and they no longer speak for or to them. So the simple point would be is, what would it be to protect the primary form of non-individual social organisation? That's the family. So if you look in the OECD, the tax rate for for households where there's a single worker and a person, usually the mother, who stays home to look after the children, is the highest in the OECD. So we tax the most ubiquitous form of the family most perniciously, and we don't support it. If you look in Hungary and Poland, what they do is the exact reverse. They heavily incentivize and support children, and they support women who support children. And if you look at the wage gap, which again doesn't exist because of discrimination, it exists because of pregnancy. And by multiple studies, 80% of any wage gap is a pregnancy gap. And that means that most women, actually, graduate women outcompete male earnings up to the age of 30.
Yep.
And then they drop out of the workforce. Normally they have children. They stay at home. They work for 2, 3, 4 years, depending on the number of children. And then when they re-enter the workforce, they enter at a part-time level, at a lower paid, in a non-career path. So these are all points. These are all the consequences of liberal autonomy that penalises any form of social care for anyone else, and these are all points that can be reversed or equalised.
And these were the kind of triggers that led significant numbers of white working class women in America to vote for Trump as a scream, despite all the appalling behaviour and pronouncements that he was associated with.
The interesting thing is Trump is delivering and Macron isn't. You know, Macron's empty kind of 1980s liberalism with kind of 1990s Blairism isn't working and isn't delivering in Europe. Trump, for all of his manifest and clear personal discrepancies, is delivering for his base. Now, he's not delivering anywhere near radically enough, but the fundamental intuition Trump has is that globalization isn't delivering for working class people. And he's right. And he's right also about unequal terms of trade. What he isn't right about, what he hasn't done, is constructed something that will actually enhance the lives of working class people. But the point is, people will vote for you if you capture and conceptualize their problems. And nobody, you know, liberals make up 12% of the population, but everything is run by and governed for them. And that time is over, thank goodness.
Do you think behind Trump and some of the other populists is a coherent emerging strategy that might become mainstream, or what's the risk that down the line there will be more authoritarianism or intolerance?
Authoritarianism and intolerance works. Look at China. There is no connection between a successful economy and a liberal economy. Actually, if you wanted to do recent work, you would argue the Chinese Communist Party is the greatest instigator of interventionist economics and economic growth. So the point is I've argued elsewhere. I wrote an essay that for the French Parliament that democracy itself risks becoming a bankrupt methodology, that the future is popular autocrats. So if you look at Putin, Putin is a popular autocrat. Even if he didn't intervene in elections, which he does, he would win, probably not far off by the percentages he already wins by, because they experienced democracy. And what the Russians experienced with democracy was capture of the state by oligarchs, the utter impoverishment of their families, and their grandmothers selling their own shoes on the street. The same is true with Erdogan. The same is true in the Philippines. The same is true with Trump. The same is true with virtually every populist movement in the country. What we're heading towards, and I'm not in favor of it, I'm merely describing it, is popular authoritarianism. Because democracy fails to distribute goods, and it fails to deliver security. And so for those at risk, the hallmark of the coming autocrat is a state that secures them, both economically and socially. And they would rather have that than the current dispensation.
Are there any lessons and parallels with what happened in the United States in the late 1890s, early 1900s, in the face of the robber barons and the huge changes that were going on in the United States? Because there, the legislators did find ways to fight back, some of which are still the basis for anti-monopoly legislation at the moment. Any lessons?
We at Respublica have just written a report called Technopoly. I've long been an advocate for changes in competition law. It was in Red Tory nearly 10 years ago. The hallmark of the modern conservative is that they extol free markets and in practice enshrine monopolies. There has been no innovation in competition law by the conservatives in the West anywhere, period. They don't understand what free markets look like, and they don't understand that markets tend to monopoly, and they identify bigness with success uncritically. What we therefore have from a lack of free market policies is the most unfree market that we've had arguably since records began. If you look at even ownership of asset distribution, it is on a parallel with the world in the 13th or 14th century.
Does Brussels and the Commission and scale have any capacity to challenge that lack of competition?
Yes.
And is that one of the reasons why significant factions inside the modern Conservative Party are so hostile to it? Or is it just a knee-jerk reaction?
Brussels has been the most advanced in competition law, and actually Germany's also advancing, so that it now, in Britain, for instance, only calls in for mergers on levels of turnover, not on level of value of the merger. So a whole host of tech deals have gone through without any competition oversight. And we still operate according to that criteria. And what Europe is proposing and Germany has already done is we do it on a values basis. But we've been in touch with the competition. We've been arguing, for instance, that consumer welfare, which comes from Judge Robert Bork's book, The Antitrust Paradox, is a pro-monopoly standard. So I would essentially argue that the criteria we have used for monopoly is pro-monopoly. And we need to license it with total welfare and innovation, which basically means we need more players, and we need to break up in whatever ways we can the new monopolies of power that we have. Otherwise, in essence, the economic game is over for most people.
You mentioned asset capture and the concentration of assets, not just in property, but across business ownership.
Yeah.
Just the scale of that, do you think people can see that from the outside? Then they see the growth of all the companies that do what's called family wealth management, as more and more Grosvenors and other family-based estates accumulate wealth to themselves.
I will also think of Amazon, the second $1 trillion company. Think of Google. Think of the way in which these people are essentially dominating the data platforms and the market places. We are in Standard Oil territory. So in Europe, a little bit earlier in the 1870s, it was the Austrians who first came up with competition law. In America, you had the Standard Oil somewhat later. They broke open the monopolies and created what we all want and what I want. I'm not a statist. I want a genuinely free market where people own assets and trade not just their labor, but also the property they own. And we're very far from that.
Going back to non-liberal solutions, now you mentioned the family as a structure, and we've had a lot of debate about intergenerational competition, but that's been contested to say that actually intergenerational transfer of assets is one of the key things that families are doing, but of course not everybody has assets to do it. So you are getting this sense of inequality in society, which is becoming worse and worse. Are there non-liberal solutions? The traditional ones would have been things like inheritance tax, but are there more modern or smarter ways of...
Here's the paradigm. In one sense, it's true that I believe in widely distributed property, so I'm more in favour of the housing market than I am of almost any other market, because it's the most widely distributed. But because it's the only market that most people can enter as owners, it's also the market where the losers pay the highest price. But we're entering a time when most people's inheritance will essentially be eroded by extensions in lifespan.
Yeah.
So that, in essence, people are going to live so long that they won't have any assets to pass on to people.
Yeah.
Because all human beings require levels of comfort which the state can no longer deliver through its contribution, and you have to be virtually indigent to get the state to contribute. So in essence, all of this personal asset wealth that we have will gradually be eroded by changes in longevity. So people won't actually be able to pass assets down in quite the same way in which they have hitherto. So what this then means, if this is true, you only need add 5 years onto a lifespan to easily absorb 30, 40, 50,000 a year in terms of care costs.
If you, does that mean that, I mean, from what you've described, I would look at Andrew Dilnot's proposals as a very effective non-liberal solution?
Anything that involves a group is a non-liberal solution. So I always favour group solutions. So I favour ceilings and floors. I favour forms of social insurance that are compulsory, so the rich don't buy into them. And I think that
but ceilings and floors lasted about 5 days in Mrs. May's general election before it crashed.
Well, that's because she didn't give either ceilings or floors. And the ceilings and floors came in after the house was built, if you will, which is very difficult to do. But it remains the case that the forms of asset wealth that we have, in principle, the gains from that should in some manner be effectively taxed via a pool to provide security for everybody. It's going to have to be something like that.
When on other non-liberal solutions, I mean, you talk about the Freerider syndrome or perception. So is the solution to that forms of earned citizenship? In other words, not only do you have to contribute, but it's only after a period of time that, say, for instance, in Scotland, you would get free tuition fees or free care.
I think that
how does that work? Because that was partly behind the original national insurance concept, that you paid in and therefore you weren't a free rider. And when that was dropped for pure need, that did produce resentment across a lot of people in society.
I think we should have a pay in and what you take out philosophy. After all, the Rochdale pioneers who set up the first ever co-op had that as their principle. And I think that needs to be a crucial part of how we run welfare systems. Now, particularly because most migrants are more economically active than the population group that they go into, that shouldn't cause any problems, because actually migrants work harder, contribute more economically to the country than the population into which they enter, because they're that younger profile. So having a contributory system would enable one to eliminate the free rider problem. And I think that should be required. We need, in some manner, to eliminate need-based approaches en masse. Obviously, there will be singular cases where that remains
but that would obviously
required.
fracture a lot of the universal principles of provision
universal
universal
principles are fractured anyway. They're dying anyway. Look at what happened with Denmark and migration. Universal principles are dying anyway. And if you want to save social solidarity, the only way to do it is to have it through what you pay in, you take out. Now, that itself is a universal principle. That's not un-universal.
We've got 2 very dramatic party conference seasons coming up. The Conservatives in Birmingham and Labour in Liverpool, 2 quite symbolic centres for different cultures, whether it's Chamberlain like Birmingham or Liverpool with all its challenges to Labour. Where do you think the political parties will be at the end of that conference season, or will everything just be in suspension until after the 29th of March and Brexit next year?
Well, I think we are in a terrible situation in which everybody knows now there are long-term trends which need addressing, but nobody's addressing them because we're heading for a cliff. And it's pointless looking beyond the cliff because we're heading for a cliff. Now, hopefully we get some form of deal, but in some sense it's right that we focus on the cliff edge. Yeah. But as a result, both of the parties are out of phase with people's real needs. And because of ideology, none of them are speaking to people's real needs. And the grounds for a new party are there, but the new party isn't in the centre because the centre isn't in the centre.
Yeah.
Where most people are is they want an economics of the left and a social philosophy of the right. If I may, where most people are is they're red Tories, which is what I argued 9 years ago. And that is what most people want, because most people need an answer to economic insecurity and social insecurity.
Now, when Theresa May became Prime Minister and before the catastrophic 2017 election, of course, her speech on Downing Street
was lovely.
Was what a lot of people thought, that she had become a red Tory and that she was chasing some of that social solidarity, making a promise in a way that startled people on the left. Indeed, some of them accused her of stealing their ground in a way that...
And that was the greatest height of personal popularity that people had seen in decades.
Yeah.
And then we had the disastrous campaign, and then we had a manifesto, the Conservative manifesto, the first few pages of which were superb, the rest were entirely empty.
Got it.
And so the tragedy for people like me, for red Tories like me, is with Nick Timothy, who et al., and his influence on the PM and the PM's natural abilities of tenacity, we had a real shot for a red Tory offer, and it was enormously popular. But when it came to the election, all we said is things are difficult and we're not going to help you. It was the lack of policy, and these people are friends of mine, I have never been able to fathom.
Okay. So just to close, what I've been trying to fathom over the past 2 days is when British political systems are going to reboot. Are clearly not going to do it this autumn. Will there be a big reboot after the Brexit exit? Will it be a reboot that people like? Will it have strands of authoritarianism or long periods of disruptive populism? But if I'd invite you, could you try and foresee the moment when British politics is rebooted in the way that perhaps liberalism and conservatism were in the mid-19th century?
Well, Robert Halfon has already suggested in Standpoint that a party be formed of red Tories and blue Labour, which actually I think would be a mass popular party. But I think that's unlikely. I think what's more likely is a Labour split from people who are likely to be deselected and the search for a centre that isn't there. Because most of the people who join the centre are liberals who are entirely unsuited to creating a new political party because they don't have mass support, because liberalism in that form doesn't have mass support. The key paradigm is that the voting base of the parties have inverted. The Conservative Party has lost the middle class and gained the working class, so that the Conservative Party voters are now less well educated, less wealthy, and live in less diverse neighbourhoods than the Labour Party. The Labour Party captured the middle classes, but has lost crucial elements of the working class. Now, the problem that Conservatives has is the problem Labour used to have. Its votes pile up in working class seats, and it doesn't have an offer that can win over the middle class without losing its electoral base. So a hard Brexit delivering Conservative Party seems very far from attracting the middle class voters that it needs. And so we're in a completely new paradigm, and as such, anything is possible.
Well, it's very interesting that question of piling up the votes in the wrong places was exactly where Stephen Kinnock started in his presentation on the spirit of Britain, and we'll hear a bit more from him, no doubt, next week. So, Phillip Blond, thank you very much.
My pleasure.